So I'm really pleased to have Dayton here and talk about his work and the gallery. And if you haven't checked that out already before tonight, please make sure to run through the gallery because this is the last night. You'll get a chance to be frightened by the piece. Just a reminder, Opus is coming up. So all of you ambitious students who want to win cash prizes and such, start making good work that you can put into Opus. That'll be the first week of April, somewhere around then, when you can submit your work. April 6th is the submission deadline. Okay, thanks. And then it sounds like we made a mistake, and I scheduled the next opening for March 10th, which apparently is like the last day of classes before spring break. So I would just love to encourage all of you to hold off on going down to Florida or Miami or wherever it is that you're going for spring break, and stick around because we're going to have an awesome artist named Chelsea Culp, and she's been working on this really great, ambitious installation for the next exhibition. So she's going to be amazing, so please, if you have a chance, stick around and come see her talk. Give it up for Dayton. Thanks.
Thank you all for coming. This is an interesting, I've done a handful of these artist lectures. This is the first time I've ever done it. I had a show at school that I've taught at, in part because it's the first time that I've ever taught at a school. So it's the first time I've given this type of thing with so many faces that I actually recognize, which is also kind of fun. It's relaxing, I guess, in a sense, and I hope I can make it interesting. Today's a very exciting day for me for this reason. This is the first day of spring training baseball, which means we are very close to actual baseball, which I'm pretty thrilled about. And I just have to say, I told my students this morning, I have two favorite teams for the most part. Philadelphia Phillies, Major League Baseball team. I'm a huge Florida State fan, Florida State University. I lived in Tallahassee for a long time. Today, the Philadelphia Phillies played an exhibition game against the Florida State Seminoles in baseball. I was torn. It was like Bizarro World, if you've ever seen that episode of Seinfeld. It was strange. But the Phillies did what they needed to do, and they whooped up on the Noles. So anyway, I had to get that out of the way because I'm just too excited about baseball. But I wanted to... So how do you do an artist lecture to mostly students that you see on an almost daily basis who hear what you have to say about art almost constantly? And so I thought what I would do was, as I started to think about the work that's in the gallery right now, it is so dramatically different from, it's probably in terms, if there were a spectrum, it's as far apart on the spectrum of art making from the work that I began to make when I started as an undergrad student 17 years ago, as I could imagine. And so I thought that for part of what I would do with the lecture in sort of trying to outline the evolution of my work from that early work to now is give a kind of a biography of the development of that, to try to both nest it within my growing understanding of historical art practices and how they influenced the difference that is evident now, and to describe a little bit how that influence continued to change my thinking about art, my interests when it came to art, and my aesthetic as far as it goes. So this is a painting. This is actually hanging in my office right now. I wish I could offload it somehow. Someone would purchase it, but nobody seems to be very interested in that. So I keep it around. But this is, really represents in a lot of ways what my interest was when I started as an undergrad. I simply began drawing when I was in high school, and that drawing developed into something that I enjoyed very much. Excuse me. I enjoyed creating these representations of space. I enjoyed the basically working on creating the illusion of plasticity, or the three-dimensional appearance of an object on a two-dimensional surface. That's not a very sophisticated or complex way to think about your entire motivation for making art, but few of us start out as complex, sophisticated thinkers when it comes to our work. So as a starting point, though, that was one of my biggest concerns. And then, of course, we have this in the gallery, the two of which could not be more different in a sense. And that's kind of what motivated me to start thinking, well, how did this happen? And a lot of it had to do with just my understanding of what art is. So this is Allegory of Spring by Sandro Botticelli, painted in the late 15th century, 1480s. And this represents in a lot of ways, in a certain sense, the way that I thought of what art was in a fundamental way. It's a very good example of the picture plane, those two verticals and two horizontal lines that create this plane of a picture, specifically in painting, that function as a sort of window through which we look. We look through this window, and within that window is this world that we are asked to engage. It's generally representing some world that is intended to be understood as outside of ourselves, that we're gazing in on something else. And during the Italian Renaissance, a lot of the imagery was mythological. So when we see an image like this, we don't assume that we're looking at something that has actually happened in human history, but it does function, as the title suggests, as an allegory of spring. But in terms of just the fundamental way of looking at a picture, that's really where I began, was this idea of the picture plane as a window through which we look. Here we have The Milkmaid by Johannes Vermeer, painted about 200 years after that image by Botticelli. Again, we have very clear sort of adherence to representation of space in an illusionistic way. We're intended to look through this and not have any problem simply feeling like we're gazing at a scene without interrogating the paint itself or anything like that. We're looking at a milkmaid. One of the fundamental differences here between this piece by Vermeer and much of his work and Botticelli is that we now understand that we're looking at a scene that is rooted in the everyday life of a person, for the most part. This is a milkmaid. She's doing her work. Now, interestingly, and I think there's probably, and not an art historian, but probably some theological parallels, the Dutch, Vermeer and whatnot, were doing this a long time before many other Europeans caught up with the sort of representation of just everyday people. They're not heroic necessarily. They're certainly not mythological, but there was some attention paid to the everyday, and that was appealing to me. So I'm jumping around here just to try to trace the contours of like how I would have understood art at this point. I would not have been able to explain or talk about any of those things like that, but I think that's actually what was going on in my head. This is a monument to Leonidas the First, and it's important in that it's a very clear example of something that art theorist Rosalind Krauss refers to as the logic of the monument. And prior to the late 19th century and early 20th century, this is pretty much how sculpture functioned in culture. And there was a logic to it, which essentially meant there was a comprehensible and universally understood way of reading sculpture. In this case, what you have is a figure, a representational figure with the trappings that help us to understand, perhaps to a certain degree, who this person was, whether or not it actually looked like them, You have a figure that's clearly a warrior. You have the shield of a warrior. You have the hand that is holding a sword. You have sort of an alert pose. So you have that figure, and then you have a pedestal, which is also an important part of this monument logic. The pedestal is what connects that figure to the place in which it sits. In other words, the logic of the monument says that it's going to follow logically that whoever this is, whether you know who they are or not, is somehow historically connected to this place in which they sit. You're not going to find this monument to Leonidas sitting in Daley Plaza, because Leonidas doesn't have a whole lot to do with the history of Chicago. But wherever this happens to be, and I'm not actually sure where that is, we can assume, or we would assume, it's there for a reason. Something happened in this particular locale which helps us situate this thing. And then finally you have the inscription. If that weren't enough, monuments almost always give you some indication through language or text of who this is. In fact, the inscription says Leonidas I, and it says Molan Lave in Latin, which translates roughly to "come and get it," bring it on. But this, I wasn't doing any work that was even remotely sculptural at this point. I'm speaking about my time in undergrad, but that is still essentially the way I would have thought of sculpture, was in these categories, the logic of the monument. Here we have Caillebott's floor scrapers. This is much later. This is the late 19th century, 1875. Again, representational space, the picture plane as window that we're looking through, but now the depiction. So one of the definitions of realism would be that what these artists were doing. Caillebott is a good example. Most famous one, Stonebreakers, help me out. Courbet, it was probably the most well-known example of an artist that realism in their mind, while they did paint representationally, realism was about actually showing us the world as it is. And so you end up with people who would not be considered heroic, mythological in any way within their culture. They begin to become sort of the subjects of what a lot of painting was doing at the time. This is one strain. Art and the ideas about art really begin to fragment over the course of the 18th century. One way that it was described to me in grad school, and that I even mentioned this to some students today, is that one way that modernism could be described is as this inclining toward greater and greater authenticity. In other words, the putting away of the inauthentic, of the mythological, of the idealized, and actually beginning to show the world as the world actually is, the real, so to speak. Van Gogh, again, in his work Night Cafe in 1888, again, as a great modernist work, you have this fairly unremarkable hole in the wall, off the beaten path cafe space. Only the main difference, and I think one of the important differences between what Van Gogh is doing here and what Caillebott, Courbet are doing, is that the paint itself, the way in which he paints it, begins to reveal itself more and more. In other words, again, you can think of it, if you want to frame it in terms of authenticity, it is further revealing the process. It's no longer trying to disguise brush strokes. It's no longer trying to smooth those over quite literally, but he's actually allowing you to see the marks that the artist has made while still remaining a sort of a picture, a window into another world. This is one of my earlier paintings in undergrad. And so, of course, I have, at that point, kind of unknowingly inherited a lot of these changes and innovations, while ignoring others. I'm still painting representationally, but I think it's fairly well evidenced here. It's not a great slide. I mean, I took this on a slide 15 years ago, so it's got its limitations. But I have no qualms, not even self-conscious about revealing some of the brush strokes. You know, I'm not trying to hide the fact that this is a painting or anything like that. And even it even begins to maybe break down a little bit this idea of you're looking through this window into this other world and presenting the object perhaps a little bit more in an immediate sense to you. Another one of these paintings that I was doing, little snapshots of real life. This was my sink in the first studio apartment that I ever lived in alone. Just a little snippet of my life, but the idea again is that I'm simply, I guess, presenting the world that was around me in this particular way, but still very much within this a particular way of looking at what art is and what painting is. I'm going to back up again. So now we're at the very beginning of the 20th century. Work completed between 1900 and 1910 by Auguste Rodin, The Walking Man. And this is a good example of something else that was beginning to happen that was really in a lot of ways married to this quest for authenticity, which was fragmentation. Rodin was one of the first sculptors that actually began to break apart the figure so that we don't have a whole. He's perfectly satisfied creating a clay that's then cast into a bronze. Incidentally, this particular bronze was cast in 1971. If you know anything about Rodin, you'll know that editions have been happening for almost 100 years after he kicked the bucket. But this idea of fragmentation is also an important thing, that as artists began to think about what was authentic, they began to reflect, what was really most important to them in a particular situation, and ignoring convention. And convention might say you put a head and some arms on your figure, and that wasn't important. I'd also point out that the ground upon which the figure is sitting, the bronze ground, is a little bit, some modifications begun to happen from this logic of the monument. Even the pedestal that it's on, the name of the artist, the name of the piece, these types of things are on that pedestal, but there's no, you don't get any kind of necessary connection to space. It's a cast. It was cast 60 years after it was created, and it was put in, I think this is like UC Santa Barbara or something like that, in a sculpture garden, because they wanted a Rodin. What became important in this case was having this well-known work by this particular artist. But we've lost, in that sense, a sort of a connection to a specific history or a specific sense of place. This is Brancusi's Endless Column, Constantine Brancusi. This was created between 1935 and 1938. An interesting thing about Brancusi, and why I include some of his work, while this may not represent exactly what I'm going to say directly, is that Brancusi was one of the first artists that began to, as he was creating sculptures, A, they became really abstracted forms, but B, he began to create the pedestals for the sculptures as really as part of the work. There are a number of Brancusi sculptures where the pedestal is part of the sculpture. You can't separate the two, or it doesn't make any sense to separate the two, because he created this pedestal for that sculpture. Again, the pedestal becoming not so much as mediator between space that the sculpture sits in and the sculpture itself, connecting the two, but the pedestal as simply a way of actually accentuating and supporting the thing that's on the pedestal. We're beginning to lose that sense of the importance of the space that surrounds the sculpture. And these things are, I think they're important. In undergrad, I wasn't thinking about these things or understanding them, but this is actually what's happening in sculpture over the course of the 20th century, and what I began to sort of, what began to wash over me and I began to understand. And then in painting, of course, Picasso was a master, an absolute genius at beginning to further interrogate and break down what does painting actually mean and what can painting actually do. So this quest for authenticity, if representation got in the way, or a plastic representation got in the way of this desire for authenticity, then he would simply discard it and begin to further break down pictures in order to help us see and understand things that we couldn't see and understand by a simple depiction. This is his famous Guernica. It was painted in 1937. And if you were to compare this to, it's about a massacre during wartime in the town of Guernica in Spain. And if you compare this to Renaissance era or even post-Renaissance era war battle scenes or things of this sort, it's a bit confusing. It's much more allegorical and much more symbolic. But in terms of its visceral impact in describing the horrors of war, it absolutely does accomplish something that the picture is the painting is simply this view into another world is not accomplishing. There's a much deeper sort of emotional impact, I think, with this type of work, and that was interesting to me. And as I did actually begin to think about those types of things, sculptural elements, as you can see, even the representation, the background of the painting begins to become much more simplified. And in this case, in order to just thinking about this idea of perhaps loss of humanity, loss of personhood, I actually cut the figure out of the canvas entirely. So I've actually now finally violated the sort of the sacred window, so to speak. It flattens the piece a lot. You no longer have that sense of space, and it begins to communicate in a different way. And then a little bit later, it just seemed like it needed something compositionally, and so I attached this light bulb fixture to it as well. As it was dealing, it was actually a reading of C.S. Lewis' book, The Abolition of Man, which is the title of the piece. And this was done in about 99 or 2000, somewhere along those lines. And then I began to get even further afield and kind of going crazy. And this is encaustic and oil on those little like escort smutty ads in the backs of like weekly big city newspapers, so decoupaged and then painted on top of, so really began to question my own dedication to this representational work, and to explore what painting, what these objects could do. And then I had a conversion experience of sorts. I do refer to this as my artistic conversion experience. This is an image of the Menil collection in Houston, Texas. And I was working, unbeknownst to me, I was working just a couple of blocks away from this building for 1 year in Houston. And I hated my job. And my lunch hours, I worked alone. So my lunch hours became longer and longer, and I was having a harder and harder time actually putting my nose to the grindstone and doing the work. And so I would walk. I'd walk to go find somewhere to eat. And one day I happened to walk this particular direction, and I happened to come upon this long, low, fairly modern building. And as I was walking by it, I noticed this trough, this steel trough that began at the surface of the grass and dug its way into the grass and then started zigzagging like a lightning bolt. And I was like, that is an interesting lawn. What is this place? And so I wandered into this place. It's the private collection of Dominique de Menil, and it's fantastic. And the show that they had at the time was a show of Cy Twombly's sculptures. You may be more familiar with his paintings because you've probably said that your 3-year-old sister or brother could do that, which is a common reaction to Cy Twombly's paintings, which couldn't be more ridiculous. But his sculptures were really, I probably would have said the same thing about his paintings, to be honest with you, at that time. But there was something really impacted me about these very simple pulling together of pieces of wood, a whole variety of everyday objects, most of them then whitewashed, at least roughly whitewashed, painted over. And something just struck me about the simplicity of these forms, the sort of just imaginative playfulness that they represented. And it was possibly, other than the paintings of Robert Motherwell, I should have put one on there, who I've always liked Robert Motherwell, even back when I didn't like a lot of abstract work, and I can't explain to you, I should have an image of Motherwell up here, but I can't explain to you because I was generally not all that attracted to abstract, non-representational sculptural work or painting. These things just blew me away. Anna, my daughter, and I actually there's a great little Cy Twombly sculpture show at the Art Institute right now, and I encourage you to go see it. I saw it just a couple days ago. So I'm all like, at this moment, I'm still talking about the same day. I leave the Menil collection and I'm having an artistic crisis because I'm looking at what I'm doing and something is profoundly unsatisfying about the type of work that I'm doing. So I'm having this moment, this artistic crisis, and I'm thinking to myself, I just need to find a place to think. I just need to find a place to relax, to think, and I decided, I was like, I'm going to walk until maybe I find a church or something like that. I'm going to sit down in church and pray perhaps, and just sit and think and be quiet in the midst of this crisis. So I walk one more block, and I see a sign. Boom, planted in the grass with an arrow, and it says chapel. I'm like, sweet. Perfect timing. So, and this is the chapel, and I walk, this is actually facing, that entrance is facing away from the street. I walk around the chapel, and I walk into the chapel, and I discover myself in the Rothko Chapel. Famous structure designed by Philip Johnson, filled with Mark Rothko's paintings. It was kind of on one of those benches where I had the conversion experience, where I was simply, it was as if I had breathed a new kind of air, and I was having a hard time shaking it. Once that atmosphere sinks deep into your lungs, there was something about it. I say it because I'm a person that very much began, that 5-6 years earlier, had been incredibly skeptical of non-representational work, of abstract work, of minimal work, which I think a lot of high schoolers actually come from that type of background, but at least this one high schooler did. That sort of, for some reason, it just simply opened up my willingness to consider that a lot of things that I thought were just kind of worthless or nerdy or too cerebral, actually were getting at something because it had affected me and it was working on me. And then I began to work as an art handler. And working as an art handler, I moved to Philadelphia and I began to see a lot of art, and I began to work very closely with particularly a lot of minimalist work. So this is the work of Ellsworth Kelly. It was driving along one day on Interstate 476 in Philadelphia. Is 476 here, or is that in Philly? That's in Philly. And I noticed a guardrail, and this guardrail had rusted over, and it was the most gorgeous rust color you've ever seen in your life. And I'm driving by this thing, and I had this moment. I had been working with this work for a while, and I had this moment. I said, well, why not just put a gorgeous color out there? Why not? Why not? So further sympathy grew for things like color field painting and what they say about the world that we live in. I was particularly influenced by the artist Donald Judd and minimalist sculpture. Now, I was completely ignorant of what they were actually doing. And what I was saying about minimalist sculpture at that time would have made Donald Judd roll over in his grave more than likely. Not that he cared who I was, but these were artists that were simply trying to, in a certain sense, completely scrub the hand of the artist from the work and make the viewer begin to think about their relationship to the object and to the space that surrounds the object. So you see objects beginning to come out of walls. You see objects beginning to, very unremarkable objects situated in space that cause you to be cognizant or aware of how you relate to them, simply because you have to walk around them, or simply because for one reason or another you have to dodge them. And while I didn't understand any of that, I found these forms, these geometric, simple gestures, absolutely gorgeous. That sort of beautiful or aesthetic quality was not a concern of the minimalists, at least in what they wrote, but it was important to me. Another example here is the work of Carl Andre. Carl Andre is incensed to many people for many years because he takes, chunks of cedar and arranges them in a gallery and sells them for millions of dollars. Bricks, steel plates, and aluminum plates, and a whole variety of different things. But again, these guys the sculpture had been removed in a lot of ways from that monument logic. It was no longer about place, but it was a shift. And not that it's a shift that we shouldn't be uncritical of in important ways, but the object really began to become concerned with its own objectness and how the viewer relates to that. So you, in a certain sense, became the subject of the work, which is very important. So just simply put, my own work, this is the very first thing that I ever made that was just a sculpture. Of course, things that, in retrospect, I notice about it, it's still on the wall. I'm a painter. I couldn't get off the wall quite yet. I was still preoccupied with being on the wall, and Donald Judd was a great little bridge between that, because here was a precedent for these wall-hanging sculptures. These were also, and I like to be careful about grouping these works. There's a whole series of these like mummy-like works. They were also very therapeutic. I had gotten very sick and almost died, and essentially these things still mostly remain in a box in my basement, because they were very kind of they were very personal. They were very much about my experience with this near death, and not really turned out toward observing the world and interpreting the world, but interpreting my own experience. And I think oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes, while those objects can function much in the same way that a journal or a diary functions for an artist, we don't go just showing our diary to everyone who walks by. And so, it was sort of, in a certain sense, I began to learn something about my own need for self-expression in one way, but also the fact that this type of expression or self-expression was not nearly as interesting to everybody else around you as it is to you. And that the one thing you have in common with everybody in this room is the world outside of your skin. And when we engage that world in terms of the content of our work, we can immediately begin to establish common ground with at least a cross-section of the population. But even that began to change. I sort of organized a group show with a collective of artists that I was working with, where we all read Fyodor Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground, and we all responded to it with new work for a show that we were doing. And this was my contribution to that show. I had essentially departed from the therapeutic or the personally centered work, and had begun to think about other things, I suppose. And this idea of conduit and pipe really became interesting to me in the way that it was it indicated to me, or it was important to me, because really, we can, if we look around, we see very little infrastructure. We see very little, if we look around, in terms of plumbing right now, in terms of wiring. But in fact, this entire building runs in many ways on conduit, wire, all of these invisible things that are hidden under the floor, behind the walls. We rely on them. We're angry if we get up in the morning and we don't have hot water. We only really get angry at them when they don't do what they're supposed to do, but we depend on them every day. So this became an interest, was this idea of the unseen and how it interacts with our life. So this idea of a pipe coming out of the wall and just doing strange things in these boxes, framing the pieces, were fairly important to me. And then this was the last of those types of works that I did, and it's important to me because it became really much more formal. I've lost the spigot. There are no more indications of like human interaction or where you might interface with it. The object backs away from you a little bit. It becomes much more simply about this form and space, and abstracting using these boxes and this pipe. And that was almost a completion of this journey toward what really became most important to me about art. But it did get me working with pipe. That piece was then immediately followed, well, about 6 months later. After I completed that piece, I did a proposal for a really large-scale site-specific installation. And that's where really this idea of working site-specifically became interesting to me. I want to make a distinction between installation in general and site-specific installation. And site-specific is installation that depends on the narrative of the space within which it is constructed. The history of it, the architecture, the aesthetics of it, it depends on that particular space in order to exist and be understood in the way that it's conceived. If you remove it from that space, it, in a certain sense, ceases to be. It cannot just simply be a sculpture that can be moved from one place to another, to another, to another. While I do continue to do those, this was a place, this is at Eastern State Penitentiary Historic Site, and was a very large, very time-consuming installation of all these red pipes that just went all over this place, paying close attention. And it actually had to do with the escape history of this. It's now a National Historic Site and a museum, so it's not a prison. Even when I did it, and as you can see, that wouldn't function very well. In cell block 6, all the doors are out in the hallway, piled up against each other. And my own escape routes were somewhat futile. Doesn't do you much good to follow my big red escape line from one cell right into another cell. But that was important. The next piece that I did after that, well, actually after a summer of complete floundering, when you're working with things you can hold in your hand, and then you make something that's made out of 2 tons of pipe that takes you 6 months or 3 months to actually create, and then you go back to your studio and you're looking around, you don't know what to do with yourself. And I was pretty stuck for a summer, but I kept making bad art, throwing it out, and pressing on. This piece then came up, the opportunity to propose a piece for this, what was at that point non-functioning historic church in downtown Philadelphia that was basically on the campus of the University of the Arts. In fact, on many days when I was working on installing this, again over a 3-month period, some Saturdays they were doing big financial aid lectures in the pews. There was a big screen with somebody talking about how you're going to pay for your kids' college, and I'm in the back building windmills and doing these kinds of things. It was an odd thing. But again, a work that really I don't see as transferable. Now perhaps you could take it, move it from one church space into another space, but it was important to me that this was a non-functioning church space as well. Here's just another image of that. This work, again, one that I think of as site-specific in this particular form. This was my studio at the School of the Art Institute in grad school, and it's called the Fish Bowl because it's actually a basement space that has a 30-foot ceiling, and this big 180-degree window up top, and it's just outside the entrance to the Columbus Drive building, which is the building on the back side of the museum. And that's where people would go to smoke, was out there on the so I was kind of constantly being surveyed. I could at any moment look up, and there was a chance somebody was going to be kind of looking at what I'm doing down there. Every once in a while, a friend would knock, and like wave at me or whatever. And so I was interested in engaging that. So what I did was created this tower, very much designed for that space in scale in every way. And so what you can see here is these are surveillance cameras. There's 4 surveillance cameras, and I had a video feed down inside my studio. There's a bullhorn, if you can't see. There's a loudspeaker on there. And then these beacon lights, which I could program to blink out Morse code messages. So I created this, the title of the piece is Communications Study. This way of like thinking about, here's a space I am. What's interesting about this space, and how can I engage it in some way artistically? And so, the fish are looking back now. I could actually know instantaneously if someone was looking at me and turn and wave. So turning the tables a little bit. So the one thing I will point out about all of these works, and this is I think important, is that they're very photographable. I really enjoyed taking pictures of these things. There's something about the way that they are situated, the materials, the experience that a viewer has, is that I've always been able to sort of share these works with people, and they continue to have a sort of life because of taking good photographs. In other words, it's not quite like being there, but something of what's going on is communicated in the photograph in all of these cases. Now I'm going to shift into sort of talking specifically about the show that's in the gallery. And there are 4 artists that I sort of conjure in the artist statement. And one is Anish Kapoor. You may know his work, the Cloud Gate, aka the Bean, downtown. The reason that I chose those 3 artists is because all 3 of those artists, James Turrell, Anish Kapoor, and Olafur Eliasson, do work that much of their work, the work that I like the most, has to be experienced in order for it to be actuated. That they simply do not photograph a lot of these things. You simply cannot approximate the experience of actually being there or seeing them through photographic means. Even more so than like the experience of seeing perhaps the pipe installation in photographs or in person. It functions even more so. And Kapoor, with pieces like the one that he's standing in front of, giant, massive, often concave, sometimes convex spaces with such a velvety powder coating that when you stand in front of them and you have no sense of perspective, you literally cannot tell how far away. You stand in front of it, you want to reach out because you want to know how far away is this surface. But it defies, through lighting and through the form and through the paint, it defies your ability to tell what exactly is the form of this object. It simply does not compute. The best way, actually, the most Anish Kapoor moment in the Bean is underneath it. If you go underneath and you look up and you ask yourself, as long as somebody hasn't thrown milkshake up there, how far away is that ceiling actually from me? That's where Kapoor happens in the Bean, because it's very difficult to tell. Do you know the reason why milkshake and hamburger and whatever else ends up on the ceiling? Because people can't tell, and they want to know, so they throw things up there to try to hit it or to try to get a sense of what's going on. Then moving on to James Turrell, again, with works, Turrell deals primarily in light, and what's going on in pieces like this, and pieces like this, and pieces like this, is that you never know immediately what it is that you're looking at. so that in this case, this triangular dimensional looking form is projected light. So this is light projected into a corner to create this. It's very carefully shaped light to create this illusion that there may be a glowing object sitting in the corner. And the same thing is happening in this case, only now it appears as if that red cube, and this one I have seen in person, that red cube is it's at the Mattress Factory in Pittsburgh. Great space if you want to see some very interesting installation work. And then with his probably most well known for the light square pieces, where when you go into a room with one of these things, you cannot tell. You can get 2 feet away from the thing, and it's very, very difficult to tell whether it is light projected onto the surface, which is what most people conclude, when in fact it's a cut out of the wall into a larger room that's filled with light. And it's amazing how, standing in front of it, how difficult to discern that is, until some brave soul, and you're looking, you're getting as close to the wall as you can, until some brave soul finally kind of like sheepishly does this, and the next thing you know, they're sticking their arm in, and everybody around them goes, whoa. But again, makes a nice photograph, but you cannot reproduce the experience of that through any kind of photographic or video means. I was having a kind of a dialogue with a friend today via Facebook on occasion, and it occurred to me that it's art that, in a certain sense, finds its goal and its meaning in the defiance of documentation. If you know anything about being an artist, documentation can be your bread and butter, because not a lot of people are going to see your art, plain and simple. And the better you document it, the more people can see it, the more you can actually disseminate it. But I've always been absolutely fascinated. I think my experiences with art have always been most powerful in these situations where it would be impossible to document in any kind of meaningful way that approximates or that is analog to the experience of actually being there. This is Olafur Eliasson's weather project, installed at Turbine Hall at the Tate Modern. Anybody knows anything about London? It's rainy a lot and it's cloudy a lot. And Eliasson created, so what you're looking at here is actually, it's a semicircular oculus with some very, very, very powerful lighting behind this oculus, and a mirror installed in the entire ceiling, so that where it hits the oculus, it creates the illusion that it's a full circle of this bright, bright light. And as you can see here, you see people in the lower level. It's difficult to see probably from where you are, but some of these people are laying down. I had one friend comment to me that she was able to see this and she fell asleep underneath it. But that Londoners flocked to this thing because it was this ever-present glowing sun. And again, there's no way you or I will ever understand what it was like to see this artwork. We can look at it in a slide, and it will not approximate our actual experience of being in the presence of it, which is kind of disappointing. I forgot this one was in there. This is at the Boijmans Museum in Rotterdam, where my wife and I spent some time during our 10th anniversary this summer. This is another of Eliasson's installations, and we spent quite a bit of time taking illegal photographs in this space. And my wife is there standing in front of the screen dancing. Again, you walk into this space, you really don't know what's going on. You see basically these horizontal, slightly moving striations going across the entire screen. And you notice that the wood floor has certain panels that actually arch up and meet at the top. And of course, you're going to step on those. And when you step on them, you see this, you see the screen change. Waves begin to emanate. Now, in the age of computer-generated art, projected art, my immediate thought was that this was some sort of, it's some kind of, what do they call those things, algorithm, or some type of digitally produced illusion of wave. And so we go around stomping on the things. But there was something unmistakably mechanical about when you made this step, you heard this like ka-chunk. It wasn't just like a switch or something. So really odd. And so you begin to kind of continue to look at the exhibit. And eventually, if you wander around, you don't realize that you're actually only in half of the room that this work is installed in. The other half of the room is this huge reflecting pool with this light shining on the surface that bounces back up on the screen, and these actual mechanical paddles. So when you step on one of those things, you're actually mechanically creating ripples in the water, which is then reflected onto this giant screen. Once again, simply an example of a work that, while you can, in this case, you can document what it looks like a little bit more, but you can't come close to describing the experience of actually being in this giant, dark, wonderful sort of space. And finally, the last person that I referred to in the text for the show is Disneyland, Walt Disney. And it was a few years ago, and I was at Disney World, and I was struck. I can't remember which ride it was. What do we do, Mr. Toad's? Something like that. You know, what you do is you're put into a car, and you are on a track, and you're led through very tightly scripted views. The car turns and tells you what to look at. The car turns and tells you what to look at. And these things are incredibly old and cheap. You know, just like painted flats that flip open and all of this kind of stuff. Not high-tech in any respect. But it accomplishes this particular experience in many ways by sort of limiting your vantage point. Because Walt Disney controls your vantage point, he can actually very simply do a lot of things effectively. And the experience of those things can be pretty magical. This picture is actually in the Haunted Mansion. And a good example of that controlling a perspective is that when you're in the Haunted Mansion, you start to go down this staircase, and if you look in the mirror next to you, you see yourself and whoever's with you, and you see this ghost sitting in the car with you. It's a two-way mirror. It's a mechanical ghost on the other side of the wall, and there's shining light on that. That's all you can see. But the effect works because you are sitting where you are, and your perspective is controlled. It's the reason why you see things the way you see things. So, I guess my interest in their work was really what led to the desire to, and it took me a while to come around to an idea that I liked and to the right situation, but was to create a work that really defied documentation. That experiencing the work firsthand was really the only way to have any semblance of actual engagement with the work. The best photograph I got was this one. But what does this tell you? If you've been in the installation, what does it tell you about the installation itself? Nothing. I mean, you cannot, because it's dealing with your sense of touch, because it's dealing with your sense of hearing, because it's dealing with your sense of sight, because it's messing around with all of those things. Even video doesn't work because the frequency of the light, doesn't jive very well with the frequency, the frame rate of video cameras. And so this idea of creating a space where, and so that's, in a way, that's how I got from painting pictures of, pots and sinks and people that I knew to this sort of hulking, minimal object with this experience inside that we see at Trinity right now. So I will if you guys have any questions, I'll open it up to that and just run the time lapse. You can look at it. You don't have to be silently watch it or anything like that, but it's kind of fun. I have sworn to myself, I've done 4 or 5 projects over the last couple of years, and always at the end of the project I go, why didn't I time lapse document that? Because it was cool. If I had a picture that airplane or something like that. So this one's not nearly as fun as a lot of them would have been, but it gives you an idea. Thanks to Abby and Emily and Josh and Chelsea Culp, actually, our next artist, for actually giving me some assistance in building this thing. It was really valuable to have a couple of extra hands every once in a while to alleviate the time and the boredom of doing it all by myself. It's kind of like watching somebody build a house, and fast forward, it's not all that.
Feels like it's on a loop.
What's that?
Feels like it's on a
You know, it looks like it's on a loop because every wall you build the same exact way. You build one, you stick it up, you lean it on the wall, and you go back and you build the next one in the exact same way. So, yeah, maybe I could have edited it shorter and nobody would have known. But this is the entirety of the installation. How I spent my Christmas break. At least a bit of it. So yeah, I don't know if you guys have any questions. I know that with a lot of you guys I have conversations all the time, but yes. What's your name?
I was kind of interested, very early in the program you showed a picture of a lawyer.
Yeah.
And one of your reasons for doing that was to suggest that that warrior, that sculpture warrior, has meaning in context just of that space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Something happened. How is that different, or is there a certain similarity between that kind of in situ sort of sculpture and the kind that you were doing with fights, for example?
That's a great question. One thing I guess I could have kind of expanded on a little bit more was that Rosalind Krauss, the same theorist, in a famous essay entitled, what's the name of this thing? What's that? Yeah, Sculpture in the Expanded Field. Thank you. She talks about the loss of the logic of the monument. In other words, that as Rodin begins to break down the figure, as sculpture begins to lose its place in that very tightly understood sense. Like, for example, I do a little tour downtown of sculptural works, and one place that we go is there's a statue, a bronze bust of Solti, one of the original conductors of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, and it's situated so that it's right next to the Art Institute, and as you stand in front and look at Solti's face, Symphony Hall is right there on your left. Again, it adheres to that same logic. If you go, not too much further afield from that, you're going to find Alexander Calder's Flamingo. You don't get that same sense that there's any necessary connection to Federal Plaza. And there isn't any necessary connection because by that point, sculpture had really, and art itself in many ways, had shifted from objects that reference histories and ideas and things outside of themselves to, as we get up, and particularly within the high modernist nest, work that is essentially self-referential. It is about itself. It's about its own scale, its own form, its own bulk, its own weight, its own color, and about asking questions not about the world out there, but about art itself. And so what Krauss, the way she describes it, is that sculpture becomes the only way to describe sculpture as that begins to happen is in the negative, And she says if it's not landscape and it's not architecture, then it's sculpture. It's this catch-all for this object. So I inherited that in many ways unknowingly. Inherited no self-consciousness about a necessary connection to place or to history when it comes to sculpture. Now I was still connecting it to things, but I inherit that mindset that if it's not architecture and it's not landscape, than it is sculpture. And I had been working with these works that were really kind of adamantly supportive of that way of looking at it. So I just simply made objects and didn't have any self-conscious internal dialogue interrogating why isn't this connected to a specific space.
But your fights do more than just draw attention to themselves, since they also articulate the space
They do.
that you created.
Yeah, in other words, while I'm doing that, and while I may not know exactly why I felt permission to not make the work figurative or not make it very specifically historically rooted, the place in which I guess I would very distinctly depart from the modernists is in my interest in metaphysics. My belief that there's a world out there that we don't see with our eyes, hear with our ears, that there are realities that exist beyond our sense to perceive them. And I think that's really, with a lot of the pipe pieces, that's what I was exploring. Again, the world behind the walls that we don't see, but that actually gives life to this building that we're in, or any building that we might be in. So yeah, I was bringing a sort of a metaphysical interest to my use of those materials, treating them as metaphor, whereas the high modernists wouldn't dare think of the materials, the objects that they were making as metaphorical, as representing something outside of themselves. Which is why these large plazas that were the product of modern architecture became these great neutral sites. The museum, for example, the modern museum was invented, the white walls, the white cube was invented in order to give that type of work the ability to be viewed disconnected from anything else, to give the work its autonomy. I'm not so much interested in autonomy of the work, but that was what was going on then. Any more questions? Thanks for coming. Please take some time, go check it out if you haven't seen it. And